Okay, couple of announcements. One is I sent you out an email about my office hours this week. I have to start physical therapy on Wednesday, so I'm not exactly sure what my office hours are going to be, so I'm not going to be able to do them Wednesday afternoon for sure. But Tuesday, Thursday, we'll still do them in the morning, 9 till 12, and today from 2 to 3:30. Okay, so just wanted to confirm that you had read that. The band pick of the week for this week is a rhythm and blues band, actually a rhythm and blues singer out of LA, and his name's Anderson .Paak. Anybody heard of him? Yeah, right. He just came out with a new album with Bruno Mars, sort of. Anyway, but you might want to go back and listen to some of his older stuff. He's, like I said, he's an R&B artist out of LA. Also, I'm going to go ahead and take roll today. Just make sure who's here, who's not here. Okay. All right, Joe Bentley, Thomas Pritchard, oh, come on, Jaden, Tyler not here today, okay, Tess Enns, Andrew, Drew Godsall, Michael Hagestad, Kaisa. Are they running somewhere this? I don't know. I'll have to. Jillian, Luke Keller, Rachel, Anthony, Carolyn Lively, who had a solo in The Messiah, and it went very well. In fact, I'll have to remember to email you because I did a little video, and I'll have to on my phone, and I know there's a way to send you an email of a video, so I'll have my son help me figure out how to do that. Okay, Vera, Lindsay Mertz, and when are you playing?
We're leaving this afternoon. We'll start Wednesday.
Okay, well, good luck. Andrew Nell, Emma, Thomas Rogers, Smith, Michaela, who also had a solo and did a very good job. And I think I might have a video of you. If I do, I'll email it to you. Sarah Strauss, Samuel, Parker, Joe Wagner, Sarah Wagner, Caleb, Aiden, and Mercedes. Okay. Was there anybody else that was in the Messiah that I missed that was in playing an instrument or anything? How many went to see that? Yeah, it was. It's a little funny that they keep singing the same thing over and over again. Like the first time I went to the Messiah, I thought they were just going to sing it, and then they keep singing the same thing over and over again. So I turned to my wife and said, "What's going on here?" But anyway, it was very enjoyable. All right, so. Last time we said we'd start out talking a little bit about the incidence of the corporate income tax, and the basically it's a general equilibrium story here. If we take a look at the incidence, like who actually ends up paying it. We already noted that you sort of have a general equilibrium story in that if we only tax one sector, if we only tax the corporate sector or not the non-corporate sector, right, stuff's going to move around. And in particular, we started out in the Harburger model that you've got a fixed supply of savings, and so that savings is going to move to, if I lower the after-tax rate of return in one sector, savings is going to move over to the non-corporate sector, right? And so that's going to change the amount of investment in the two sectors. And we looked at the excess burden that would be happening because the marginal social rate of return pre-tax would be greater than the opportunity cost in the non-corporate sector if we were looking at what was going on in the corporate sector. And so that gave us what was going on with the excess burden. So again, just there's, the first thing that starts out is that there's a reduction, right, in investment, and therefore the capital stock, right, in the corporate sector, and there's an increase in investment, again, the capital stock in that non-corporate sector. Well, what's that going to do? If you sort of think about it, that's going to change the supply of goods in both sectors, right? So that'll change Q in both the corporate sector and the non-corporate sector. So I've got if I've got less stuff being produced in the corporate sector because now there's less capital and less investment, and there's now going to be, and that capital's moving over into the non-corporate sector, there's going to be an increase in the supply, right, in the corporate sector, in the non-corporate sector, and a decrease in supply. So what's that going to do? That's going to change the prices, right? So we've got to have these things. When I get more mobile, I'm going back to the blackboard. I just really not happy with these things. So what will happen is that we're going to have prices going up in the corporate sector, and we ought to have prices going down in the non-corporate sector. So what I've got is a change in the prices of all sorts of goods going on, depending on what happens in the price elasticity of demand and the price elasticity of supply, right? So if there's a high price elasticity of demand, you're going to get bigger changes so that the price elasticity, as we've talked about before, the price elasticity of demand and supply is going to affect how much of this occurs, right? It affects how much of this movement is going to be happening. Now, if you have a household that spends a large portion of their income on what's going on in the corporate sector, they're going to see a decline in real income, right? I mean, if there was a big shift out of the corporate sector into the non-corporate sector, and there was a large change in the prices that are going on in that corporate sector, if you want to think about in terms of real income, then if we had a large price increase, if you had a large price increase in the corporate sector, then you have lower real income for households who buy from the corporate sector. So that if we're thinking about the if we're thinking about how this affects the distribution of income, the people who tend to buy a lot of stuff from the corporate sector, if there's a big change in price because the change in quantity is such that there's a big change in the prices, then what will happen is they'll have a decrease in real income relative to people who are buying stuff from the non-corporate sector. Now, also you got to think about what's going to happen to wages, right? Because I got capital moving back and forth, and when I'm producing less stuff in the corporate sector, I'm going to use less labor, right? So I'm going to have an effect on the demand and supply of labor, right? So if we just look at wages, do this. If we look at wages, then what's going to happen to wages is going to depend on the margin rate of technical substitution in the two sectors, right? What's the capital labor ratio? Remember, the margin rate of technical substitution is the so it depends on the margin rate of technical substitution, which is the capital labor ratio in the two sectors. Right, so I got, again, it's a matter of, there's all sorts of stuff going on that you got to think about. And the degree to which this happens depends on things like the price elasticity of demand, the capital labor ratio in the two sectors, and of course they hire economists. If you were working for the Janet Yellen because what is she talking about? Raising the corporate income tax, right? That you're going to hire people to try to find out, okay, how much of that, how big are these effects, right? So people are out there estimating this sort of thing. So, but anyway, it depends on what the marginal rate of technical substitution is in both sectors. Now, if they differ, then, right? Then what might happen is you get a bunch of capital going out of the corporate sector into the non-corporate sector, or a bunch of labor going out of the corporate sector into the non-corporate sector. And the question is, can we, how easy it is to absorb that, right? So if they differ, then how easy is it for the non-corporate sector to absorb the labor, right? That's coming from the corporate sector. It may be that if the capital labor ratio is such that it's difficult to bring in labor, if I had a non-corporate sector where it was difficult to bring, let's say has a pretty fixed capital labor ratio, then what happens is labor's all coming in, but in order to get me to hire more labor and switch my capital labor ratio, I got to have wages decline a lot. If I don't have very many, if the capital labor ratio is much higher in the corporate sector, then not a lot of labor is going to show up in the non-corporate sector, and so it won't have a big effect on wages in the non-corporate sector. But if you had the other way, where there was where when this labor gets released, if the non-corporate sector can't absorb that labor very easily, then wages are going to fall a lot in order to get you to absorb it. So it depends on what the difference is on the capital labor ratio and how easy it is to switch your capital labor ratio in the sector that's in the non-corporate sector as it's absorbing this labor from the corporate sector. Now, if quantity is changing, then price is changing, right? And we said that there's you'll have an increase in the price of goods in the corporate sector for a couple of reasons. But one is, right, you've got the, so you have the price of goods is going up in the corporate sector, but what's that going to do? Because Q is falling. Now what we have is right, if you think back to ECON 202, you got complements and substitutes, right? So if I change the price, remember that if you think about the Econ 202, what determines what the demand curve looks like for a particular good, right? One of the things is your income, one of the things your preferences, but one of the other things is the price of a substitute. So if the price of oranges goes up, then the demand for apples would shift to the right, right? And that would affect the price of apples. If their price of hot dogs goes up, you're going to demand less hot dogs, but that means you'll demand less hot dog buns at the same price. So the demand for complements will shift to the left. So what will happen is that when the change in the price of goods in the corporate sector, that's also going to affect all the prices of complements and substitutes. And of course, that will depend on what the demand curves look like for those goods, what people's marginal rate of substitution is between any two of those goods. So if these change in the change in the output is going to change prices, but the change in these prices is going to change the demand for these other goods, which is all going to change their prices. And so now you get more things happening and more things to have to think about. Now, what if some of these goods in the corporate sector are inputs, right? So we're looking at the price of inputs. What happens when they change? If you think about how supply curves work, right? Then the marginal cost of producing those goods will change. So if there's a bunch of goods in the corporate sector that because we've put a corporate income tax on, we've changed the quantity of those goods, and that's changed the price of those goods, and those goods are inputs into other goods, then that will change the supply curve or the marginal cost curve for the goods those are inputs into, right? So when that changes the marginal cost curve, what's that going to do? That's going to change the price. Change the price of those goods. So if we think about the incidence of this when we start looking at general equilibrium, then we're going to be talking about all sorts of different things that could happen. And what's going to happen is an empirical question. How elastic is the demand for these goods? How elastic is the supply of these goods? What's the margin rate of technical substitution between capital and labor in the two sectors? Which goods are inputs into other goods, and which goods are complements and substitutes, and how big a change will affect that change in the price of those other goods too. So if we sort of think about this, then what it says is that the tax might be shifted to labor. Right? It might be shifted to labor in the two sectors. I'm making it so there's less capital being made in the corporate sector, right? There's less investment, so over the long term there's less capital there. The marginal product of labor is going to be affected by how much capital there is, right? So again, we've got this marginal product of labor is going down in the corporate sector. But the marginal product of labor is going up in the non-corporate sector, right? Because investment's increasing in the non-corporate sector. And as the labor's moving back and forth, that's going to affect the price of labor. So it could be that labor has some of that burden in the corporate sector because the marginal product of labor is now less in the corporate sector. Labor could be getting some of the burden of the tax in the form of lower wages in the non-corporate sector because labor's moving out of the corporate sector into the non-corporate sector. How much does that happen, right? Again, depends on a lot of things, but it depends on that marginal rate of technical substitution between capital and labor and the elasticity of demand and supply for the goods and all sorts of things. Now, if we look at the progressiveness of the tax, like, is the corporate income tax a progressive tax, right? Well, we assumed it was to start with, right? Because we assumed that, if we go back to Harburger, what did we assume? We assumed that it was a tax on capital, right? Because it's a tax on the return to capital. We did not, and again, Harburger was focusing on the inefficiency of moving investment from the corporate sector to the non-corporate sector, right? He was acting, that's why this Catus Paribus assumption of the supply of savings for investment is fixed. So we assumed that it was falling on capital. But if you sort of think about it, even if you have that fixed supply of savings, total supply of savings, goods, capital moving, and that means that labor's moving, that means that output's moving, that means that prices are changing, that means that real wages are changing, et cetera. To the extent that this is a tax on capital, it's generally perceived as a progressive tax. It's generally progressive because wealthier people tend to have more of their wealth in capital. But it might be that this, if it's shifted to the consumer in the form of higher prices, if it's shifted to labor in the form of lower wages, then some of that burden could be falling on consumers who have lower income, right? So to the extent that it's shifted to consumers in higher prices or to labor in terms of lower wages, then it'll be less progressive. And again, there will, the extent to which this happens is an empirical question. And it might be different in the year 2021 than it was in 1982. Yeah. Drew.
Would you say regressive then because the burden grows on people who are making less money as the prices go up more?
Yes, it could be regressive. It could, I mean, again, if a big chunk of the tax ends up in the form of higher prices on goods that, and low-income people consume a higher portion of their budget than do high-income people, a tax on consumption would be a tax that is going to be, remember that whether it's progressive or regressive depends on the average tax, right? What is your tax divided by your income? So if I am wealthy, but I'm Scrooge McDuck and I don't spend very much, right? Then when we have a tax that falls on prices and falls on consumption, that portion of the tax is going to be lower as a percentage of my income than it is for somebody that has no savings, right? That consumes all of their income. And so it could be that the tax could end up being regressive. Now, again, if you, I remember that I put in the subfolder a National Bureau of Economic Research paper recently done on, it's called Who Bears the Burden of the Corporate Income Tax? And you can, it generally comes out that it's going to be more borne by the owners of capital, but not as much as in the Harburger model would have it. But still, generally people, generally economists believe that the burden of the corporate income tax is falling more on the owners of capital than it is on other folks. Again, it's possible that it could be regressive if a whole bunch of it fell on consumers in the form of higher prices and labor that worked in the non-corporate sector and they didn't make very much money and their wages fell substantially, then it could end up being regressive. Again, empirically, you're not probably going to find that to be the case. In general, the empirical analysis comes to the conclusion that it is it's a tax on capital. So if we just summarize what's going on with the corporate income tax and just sort of think about that in summary, first of all, there's going to be if the supply of capital, or excuse me, if supply of savings is not perfectly inelastic, that is, we relax the Harburger assumption of a fixed supply of savings. So if we just sort of summarize the major points, right? Summarize the major points here. If the supply of savings for investment is not perfectly inelastic, then what did we get? When we looked at that, we said, well, there's a excess burden that's coming from that, right? We noted that we noted the excess burden that's coming from the corporate sector investment going to the non-corporate sector, but when we relaxed that assumption, we noted that there is an excess burden, right? So again, if we look at the income compensated supply curve for savings, or if there's not a lot of income effect from that, then we can find that welfare loss triangle, or that excess burden triangle. There'll be an increase marginal cost of production. Right? Because what's happening is I'm going to have in order to produce the same amount of stuff, I got to have more capital because my net return is lower, so there's going to be less there. So there's less output than without the tax, right? So there's going to be less stuff in the world if we have a tax on capital. So there's less production. Again, the total reduction in investment depends on this supply of savings, right? This determines the amount of output that is reduced depends on the overall supply of savings, because the total reduction in capital, right, as new investment, that depends on the supply of savings. Okay, so again, Harburger assumes perfectly inelastic supply of savings. You don't have any excess burden of the tax from that perspective. The excess burden is all coming from a movement from the corporate to the non-corporate sector. But it's possible that supply of savings, again, might be different today than it was in 1983, And so it may be that there is a larger effect on the amount of capital overall. Again, the excess burden from, so again, summarizing the excess burden from a movement of the corporate to the non-corporate, that depends on the marginal social rate of return, right? The marginal social rate of return in the two sectors, right? Sort of depended on what that, remember we had that, the demand curve, so the equivalent of the demand curve is that marginal social rate of return curve. And that, that when we move the supply, that the excess burden triangle will depend on what that marginal social return looks like. All right. That led me to, again, I said you might want to take a look at this Janet Yellen's Wall Street Journal article from a couple days ago. And if I don't remember if I actually wrote down the title of it, but, well, first of all, any questions on what we've just been going over, okay? Basically, this incident of the tax is like a general equilibrium thing, okay? And how much there is of all these extra steps of things is an empirical question. How much capital, labor flows from the two sectors will depend on the marginal rate of technical substitution and which goods are inputs and which goods are complements and substitutes. Andrew, yeah.
We were talking about how easy it is for the non-corporate sector to absorb the labor from the corporate sector. Is that determined by the capital labor ratio, or is it determined by the capital labor ratio?
Well, it is determined by it in the sense that how easy is it for me to substitute capital for labor? And is there big differences between capital labor? When capital is being released in the corporate sector, labor is also being released in the corporate sector, right? So, because I'm making less stuff. So that stuff's going to move on over into the non-corporate sector. Depending on what that capital labor ratio looks like, and can they change it very easily, right? I may have right now a certain capital labor ratio producing, Amazon, okay? But Amazon might switch and hire a lot more people to come in instead of robots to do stuff, right? So they have the ability to absorb labor because, let's say, the way that Amazon packages goods, it's, they can easily switch from a lot of robots and not too many people to not too many robots and lots of people. If there's something about the way that you produce things that you can't easily change that you have a fixed capital labor ratio and just that's the way you got to do it, then that's going to affect what's going to happen to the ability of the non-corporate sector to accept the labor and capital that's coming into the non-corporate sector from the corporate sector. Okay, again, it's a matter of, talk about in 105 quite a bit about Sherlock Holmes, right? When Watson in Scarlet Pimpernel, right? Watson comes in and he says, he sees Sherlock up in his room, and he walks up the stairs and he knocks on the door, and Sherlock has him come in and they're talking for a while. And then Watson says, Sherlock says to Watson, he says, Watson, how many steps are there coming up from the ground floor, right? And Watson goes, geez, I don't know. And Sherlock says, Watson, how many times have you come up and down those stairs? And he says, Watson goes, geez, I don't know, like hundreds of times. Says, there are 17 steps coming up from the ground floor. Watson, the problem with you is you see, but you don't observe, okay? And that's what's going on in economics classes, right? They're getting you to see what to observe. I don't just go, raise that corporate income tax. Let's raise it to 40% because wealthy people have more, more capital than do lower income people, and we can tax those rich corporations, Amazon and all those corporations, right? Again, maybe you want to do that. But you got to think through what all the other things that you didn't observe. Now, once you've figured them out, you may want to do it anyway. In fact, in my 105 class, I was just talking about minimum wage. And we were talking about if you increase, like if you listen to the debate over minimum wage, you get the same thing, right? Where they say, all these people are going to, now be able to live on their $15 an hour, and they'll have more income, and da-da-da-da. And they don't mention the fact that, yeah, but some people are going to lose their jobs, right? Now, you may want to raise the minimum wage anyway. You could say, hey, you know what? Some people are going to lose their jobs, but there's going to be a much bigger benefit from the people that gain their jobs than the losses the people that lose their jobs. Fine. But you can't just say, hey, I want to raise the minimum wage and not talk about there's a cost to it. Similarly here, there's a big discussion going on about raising the corporate income tax right now. Like I said, Janet Yellen just had her article in the Wall Street Journal 2-3 days ago. And what we're trying to do here is to say, let's observe what's going on. Now, there's a public choice perspective on this. That is, if most people haven't had Econ 402 and they're not aware of Harburger model and they're not aware of general equilibrium analysis, then the politics might have me be in favor of it anyway, right? And interestingly, anybody know who Janet Yellen is married to? She's married to a former professor of mine from Berkeley who's retired a number of years ago, but his name's George Akerlof. Anybody heard of George Akerlof? Yeah, Nobel Prize winner in economics. Well, he's married to a Nobel Prize winner in economics. So I'm guessing Janet probably knows this, right? She's also the only person to have been chairman of the Fed and be Secretary of the Treasury. But anyway, let's just take a quick look at her article in the Wall Street Journal. It's called A Better Corporate Tax for America. And it's sort of interesting. She starts out saying that the corporate tax collections in the last 3 years have fallen to 1% of GDP, which is the lowest level since World War II, right? So her first point is corporate taxes fell to 1% of GDP in the last 3 years. Now, the average person that's reading that article is going to go, wow, that's pretty low, right? And indeed, it is moderately low. And if we look at the last 3 years, it has been at 2018, 19, and 2020. It was 1%. If we look at 2018, 2019, and 2020, indeed, it was at 1%, 1.1%, and 1%. And again, I gave you, at the beginning of the class, I gave you a bunch of sites that you can go to look up these numbers. Probably the best place for this is the Congressional Budget Office Budget Outlook, right? If you look at the CBO Congressional Budget Office, their budget outlook, that's probably the best place to get up-to-date numbers on what's going on with terms of revenue. But now if we look at their estimates for 2000, so it was 164 billion in 2021, which is a little bit different number that I gave you earlier, but if we look at the February 21st CBO budget outlook that came out, if it's the it has for the actual fiscal year 2020, it was 212 billion. So fiscal year 2020, 212 billion, which is this 1%, about 1% of GDP. Now, again, if you look at the corporate income tax, it's the third largest portion of revenues for the federal government, but it's not a huge portion. And remember, we noted last time that it tends to fluctuate quite a bit, right? It fluctuates depending on what's happening with economic activity, right? If there's a downturn in the economy and corporate profits fall, they may fall much faster than wages do or personal income does. And so again, let me just write down what the just to give you an idea what the numbers were for if we look at the numbers for again, these are actual fiscal year 2020. The individual income tax is 1.609 trillion. The payroll taxes, Medicare and Social Security, is 1.3 trillion, 1.310 trillion. This is payroll tax. And then, as I said, the corporate income tax is, although it's the third largest, it's 212 billion, right? So it's the third largest source, but if you think that it's, let's say you think that the corporate income tax is 1/3 of the tax revenue to the federal government, and somebody says to you, oh, it's fallen to 1% of GDP, the lowest level that it's had since World War II, you're going to be going, oh, wow, that is a major deal in terms of revenue to the federal government. Then it's interesting, if you look at the estimates, the Congressional Budget Office estimates for the next fiscal years, this is their estimate. If we look at 2022, their estimate is 252 billion. If you look at 2023, the estimate is 304 billion. If you look at 2024, it's 328 billion. So the implication that Jennifer Yellen, our Secretary of Treasury is that we've got the 2017 corporate tax cut that's what's causing it, right? That's sort of the implication. But if you look at what happened in terms of the economy as a whole, right? Had COVID not come along, then you might have had much greater economic growth and you wouldn't have had this drop to the 1.1%, because now if you're looking at what the CBO is estimating in terms of the corporate income tax, they're estimating a increase in the corporate income tax. And so the implication here might be that it wasn't the tax cut that over the long term, certainly in the short term, right, you're going to get a drop in the corporate income tax in the short term, because the increase in the stock of capital and everything else that's going to happen and the increase in output that's going to happen is going to take some time for that to go along, right? But the Congressional Budget Office is showing the economy coming out of the recession, and that means that these concern about the drop in corporate income tax revenue might not be as large as Janet has suggested. And then she says that many paid no federal income tax at all, right? And that is true, that some companies in any particular year avoid paying the corporate income tax. All right, she says, right, many paid no corporate income tax at all. And why is that? Because if you're an international corporation or you can set up subsidiaries, what you can do is on paper, you can move, right? You can move profit to other countries that have a lower tax rate. Now, the 2017 Jobs Act, or a tax cut, tried to deal with that and had some provisions to lessen the ability of countries to move profits to other countries, and has a minimum tax that's coming out of this. This article, she argues that wasn't done very well, and so companies can still do that. But her point is that income gets shifted from low tax to high tax, or excuse me, from high tax to low tax. And her point here is that leads to a vicious cycle of we lower our our corporate income tax, that causes other countries to lower their corporate income tax, which causes us to lower our corporate income. And she's worried about she's worried about this, what she calls a vicious cycle of reducing our corporate income tax, so that this competition among countries to lower the corporate income tax results in a race to the bottom. Again, we'll finish this up a little bit next time, but what she wants is the United States to agree with the OECD countries. Remember, we talked about the fact that when we cut our corporate income tax down to 21% at the federal level, and then on average it's about 3% depending on the state, so it's 25% overall on average, that moved us to a little bit above what the OECD countries are. And what she wants to do is to have everybody agree, the OECD countries and the United States, to agree to establish a minimum corporate income tax, so that you can't, so we can't keep cutting our corporate income tax. So anyway, if again, you might just Google her article and bring that up, and we'll finish up talking about that on Wednesday, and then we'll start the section on consumption taxes. That'll be the next thing that we do. All right. So again, office hours are going to be a little odd on Monday, Wednesday, Friday this week. Tuesday, Thursday still be in the morning.